David, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. My name's David Skrbina. I'm a philosophy professor. I taught for many years, about 18 years, at the University of Michigan at the Dearborn campus. Left there a couple of years ago. Been working now with a group in Finland at the University of Helsinki. We've been doing some research primarily in sustainability studies and environmental ethics, and just been doing some independent writing, researching, publishing stuff on various topics of philosophical interest. I've got a couple of different specialties. Philosophy of technology is one area of interest, philosophy of mind. I also do quite a bit of work in, and then environmental ethics and related sustainability questions. And yeah, sort of part of all of that is the discussion about religion and sort of the effects on society and traditional Christianity in particular. So that was a long-standing interest of mine. Maybe the oldest. I think way back at the beginning, back in middle school, I was always a skeptic and a critic of Christianity. Didn't really know much about it then. Didn't really have any basis for it. It was just kind of an intuition that something was wrong there. And it was only much later that I started to dig into it, and then ended up publishing this book, the Jesus Hoax, a few years ago.
Awesome. So the topic being is Jesus a hoax? What led you to start considering that he wasn't real? I assume, like most people, that you kind of just took for granted that he was, and then later found out something that made you start to doubt. And so what was that made you really start to question the efficacy of the New Testament?
Well, I suppose, way back when it was just the miracle stories, right? So we have these crazy miracles of Jesus. There's, I guess, 36 miracles documented in the New Testament. And, they range from, calming the seas and the fishes and the loaves and raising people from the dead and curing the lepers and so forth. So, I mean, to me, this is like, obvious nonsense. It's just mythology, it's legend and so forth of miracle healers and so forth. The virgin birth. I mean, none of that stuff I ever really accepted as true. I said, well, obviously somebody just kind of, was relating stories that they heard or made something up along the way, or talked to somebody who heard it from somebody else. And there's these crazy sort of stories. So, I mean, yeah, to me, it was obviously mythology, the whole kind of God concept of a moral God who's up there listening to you and you can talk to him and he answers you. I mean, that seemed like that was nonsense to me, but didn't really go into the details of it a lot. It wasn't really until much later, I guess, even, sort of my postgraduate years that was doing more research on kind of what's actually in the Bible, kind of the history of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And then in particular studying Nietzsche. So, of course, I studied all the major philosophers and I've taught them. This is part of what I've done. And Nietzsche had some really interesting ideas about what was going on with Christianity, why it was a problem. He thought it was a kind of a disaster for Western civilization. And then he was dropping some clues in some of his writings that there's this fellow Paul, so Saint Paul, who more or less kind of constructed this story, this whole Jesus story, just kind of made it up for some reason, and then was using it to his advantage or to the advantage of his people at the time. And I remember thinking, well, that's a really interesting, strange kind of idea that Paul, who's sort of always in the background, maybe not quite in the foreground of Christianity, just sort of one of those background guys like, Mark and Matthew and Luke and so forth. I never really knew much about him, but to realize that he made things up, possibly, was quite a revelation. So that was one big step for me. Secondly, was when I dug into the actual dating, the timing of the documentation of the New Testament. So the New Testament is basically the four Gospels that everybody knows, and then a bunch of letters by Paul. And that's, 90% of the New Testament. And, the letters by Paul come, 20 years after the crucifixion, The Gospels come 30, 40, 50 years after the crucifixion. To me, that was a kind of a shock. You would have sort of expected the Gospels, which are relating the words of Jesus. You would think, well, those would have been written down, yeah, right away. I mean, maybe during his lifetime, maybe immediately after the crucifixion, immediately after he's risen from the dead, and it's obviously a miracle. Well, that's when you would start writing down all of his words and what he said, and you got to pull his story together. But no, that's not how it works. Even according to the official story, it was decades later before somebody started writing down this guy's story, how he was born, what he said. And then I'm thinking, well, that's like crazy. Wow, how could that happen, right? So you take that piece and you marry it with the Nietzschean thesis that Paul is just constructing a story, and then you just kind of follow the logic through, and you say, well, look, somebody made up a story. They tried to convince people that it was true. It wasn't true. So yeah, it was a kind of a fraud, a kind of a hoax, a kind of a lie to serve the benefit of Paul and his fellow Jews, who were the oppressed people by the Roman Empire at the time. And then I think that whole story pretty much comes together. The evidence that we know, the evidence that we don't have, that we should have. You look at the whole picture, and I think it's quite conclusive. The conclusion is very definitive that there was a kind of a hoax or a fraud going on in the story.
So the first question is obviously the consensus among historians, even secular historians like Bart Ehrman, is that Jesus did exist. And so why do you think that their position disagrees with yours? And are they missing something? Do you have evidence they don't? Or do you think it's some kind of dogma? What is the reason that most of academia thinks that Jesus did in fact exist?
Right. So there's really two issues here. So was Jesus the physical human being, the mortal human being, the man? Did he exist? And did Jesus, the Son of God, the miracle guy, right? Did he exist? Because you could have one without the other, right? Clearly. When you look for contemporaneous evidence at the time that Jesus lived, right? Supposedly he was born between 3 BC and the year 0. He would have been crucified about the year 30 AD. So he's got about a 33-year lifespan. This is the typical story. His ministry was in the last 3 years, say from the year 27 to the year 30. So this is when he's preaching. This is when he's doing the miracles. This is when everything's happening the last 3 years. And then he's crucified in the year 30. So you would expect there would, if there's really this miracle man, he's walking on water, raising the dead, curing people, you would think there would be, let's say, some documentation by somebody at the time of these events that were happening. So you would expect certainly his followers would be documenting something in some form, writing or engraving or carvings or something. You would expect the Jews who were not Christians, maybe just observing things that they heard these miracle stories. You think they might be commenting either positively or negatively. And you would expect the Romans, Pontius Pilate in particular, who was the ruling authority in Judea at the time, you would think because they're in charge of what's going on, they have their ear to the ground and they're trying to, hear what's going on. And if some fabulous miracle man shows up, you would think they would document it, write some letters, write back to Rome, investigate it. So instead we have nothing. We have literally nothing from Jesus's lifetime, the first 30 years of the century. We have nothing for 20 years after that. Nothing, absolutely nothing by the followers, nothing by the Jews, nothing by the Romans. Then we have the very earliest letters by Paul, which typically considered Galatians or 2 Corinthians, and those date to about maybe the year 50, we think. So this is 20 years after the crucifixion. And Paul is just sort of relating in very general terms what's going on. He's not really talking about this guy, Jesus. He never met this guy, Jesus. He just had some miracle vision 3 years after the crucifixion. This is the official story. So things just don't add up. I mean, you just don't have the concrete evidence. There's actually no real evidence to believe that really any such guy as Jesus of Nazareth ever existed, frankly, if you really want to be honest about it. I suspect, and this is kind of just my working hypothesis, that there probably was a guy, there was a physical guy He was a Jewish rabbi. He probably advocated for the poor. Like most of the Jews, he probably hated the Romans. He probably tried to rally the low and the impoverished Jews against the Roman rule, and probably told them to fight back and resist the invader and so forth. And he probably caused some trouble. Probably got himself crucified. I can certainly imagine that that would have happened. And then he died. He's gone, like lots of other political rebels at the time. And I can imagine that Paul, since the thesis is he's really constructing this miracle story, Paul probably took the actual story of a real guy who was an agitator and maybe a speaker and maybe an inspirational figure and maybe got crucified, took him as the core of this thesis, of this hoax, of this fraud that he's constructing, and then used his story and then embellished it and turned it into a miracle man, son of God, here to save humanity, and so forth. I just it's kind of the working hypothesis that any fraud or any hoax works best if there's a little kernel of truth at the center of it, rather than just a complete construction of from nothing, right? So I suspect, this is just kind of my hypothesis, that there was an actual guy, and that was the little kernel of truth behind Paul's fraud, and later the gospel writers' fraud, that they constructed around this little bit of a true story. So I suspect there was a mortal guy, certainly not a miracle guy, certainly not a son of God, but probably just a regular rabbi, political agitator, got himself crucified, and he's dead and gone.
You mentioned that Paul and then later the gospel writers.
Yes.
So are you implying that gospel writers came after Paul?
Well, yes, that was kind of one of those surprising revelations to me. I mean, when you sort of know the story about Paul, how important he is, and obviously the Gospels are important because they contain all the factual data, the autobiographical data, or biographical data about Jesus and what he said. And you just sort of assume that they were sort of there together at the same time, but that's not how it worked, right? So Paul lived, wrote his letters, tried to build this Christian church, and died, and he never mentions the Gospels. It's really a striking fact. If you look at all the letters from Paul, there's the authentic 7 letters, even those are a little bit dubious, and sometimes they talk about the 13 epistles of Paul. But whether you call it 13 or 7, you can look at any of those. There's zero mention of the Gospels. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of strange. Why wouldn't Paul, because he's trying to build the church, why wouldn't he refer to the Gospels or quote from the Gospels? And the reason was because they did not exist. The Gospels were not written any time in Paul's lifetime. He tried to build this church between the years 50 and 70 AD, we think, and then he dies. We don't quite know when or why, maybe in the year 66, maybe in the year 70. Then there's the revolt in Jerusalem. The Jews revolt against the Romans win, they destroy the temple. This is in the year 70. Paul's dead, he's gone, and then after the revolt, then the first gospel shows up, and that's the Gospel of Mark. And it just comes out of the blue. We don't know who it is. There has a name, Mark. That doesn't really mean anything. That's just like Bob's gospel. It doesn't really tell you anything. So this gospel just appears out of the blue just after the time of the Jewish revolt against Rome. So it's interesting. So Paul lives, dies, writes his letters, and there's never a gospel. Those don't get written until years later, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. That's when the Gospels appear.
And do you think that it's the case that the Gospels were being transmitted like orally at the time period? Because I imagine most people during the time period weren't very literate. And so would they at the time period consider writing these down even if they happened, or would it be more likely that they would express them through verbal language and try to pass them on that way?
Well, that's the story, right? So these are relatively simple people. There wasn't mass education at the time, and only the very elite people knew how to write and read. So probably the masses could neither write nor read, but some people could read and write. I mean, that was always true. That was true for hundreds of years. You go back 500 BC, and you got Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. Those guys can write and read, obviously. So people knew how to write and read. Some people did. But you can imagine if Jesus, if we believe the story, he's doing his miracles among the poor and the impoverished. Well, they're uneducated. They don't know how to read. They see these miracles. They can't write them down. But if somebody must have witnessed them, In fact, lots of somebodies would have witnessed these miracles, right? Some of them were only a couple of people were present during the miracles, but some, like the fishes and the loaves, this is like thousands. Was it 5,000 people? I think that actually occurs twice. People, I don't think many people know that there were two fishes and loaves miracles, and I think, but the first one was 3,000 people, and the second was 5,000 people. You had thousands of people there that witnessed this miracle from Jesus. He's cutting up the fish and feeding thousands of people. So, well, certainly there would have been somebody who could write in this crowd of 5,000 people, but nobody wrote anything. But even if they were just there and they were just watching, and then they're seeing what's going on, they're uneducated peasants, and then they go home and they say, "Wow, you won't believe what happened. This guy, he fed 5,000 people with 5 fish, and then so what happens? Well, then they must have, remembered this. They would have told their neighbors, they would have told their children, the children grow up, and then they tell their children, because we're talking generations later. So somebody told somebody who told somebody who told somebody. That was the oral tradition, if we believe that story. And that would have gone on for, right, a minimum of 40 years if the crucifixion was in the year 30, and if the Gospel of Mark was in the year 70. So a minimum of 40 years of somebody relaying it to somebody else or telling somebody else, and maybe 1 or 2 or 3 generations. And if you look at the latest Gospels, like John, which is the last written Gospel, and that was about in the mid-90s, about the year 95. So this is 60, 65 years after the crucifixion. So again, more time goes by, people telling stories, somebody tells somebody who tells somebody who tells somebody, and we all know how that goes. When you pass an oral tradition along, things get changed, things get added, things get dropped out, things get a little bit better, the story gets a little juicier, right? So you can well imagine if that's how it went. Somebody amped up the story and it got a little bit better, and a little better, and pretty soon this guy's the Son of God and he's raising people from the dead, and so you can kind of imagine how that might have gone. I mean, that's one theory about how this went. I tend to think that's probably not a good story. Probably it's better. The better story is that there was an active effort by the gospel writers to construct a bogus story, maybe based on little rumors that had been floating around about this guy Jesus and what a great guy he was, and he was a super person and fantastic speaker and very inspirational. Okay, I can accept all of that. But to document that 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, that's just makes no sense. It's virtually guaranteed to be wrong, and almost certainly to be a kind of literary construction at that point.
How much of it is a construction versus based on the kernel of truth? Like what is the kernel of truth? Was there actually a guy named Jesus? Did he actually do the same things that other miracle workers were doing at the time period and that got embellished? Or was the entire existence of this man essentially a culmination of a bunch of other characters?
Right. Well, I mean, there were stories of various saviors and healers and magicians at the time. You can imagine sort of the state of thinking in the year back then, in the year 0. And it was a difficult time for the Jews in Palestine and Judea. They were oppressed by the Romans, who were this invading force who came in 63 BC, took over, right, dominated the whole community, threw the leading elite Jews out of power, probably exacted tributes and taxes, and maybe plundered their temple, and who knows what they would have done. Typical things you would do by an invading army. So it was obviously very stressful, difficult for the Jewish communities, and they would have looked for any help anywhere, from God, from saviors, from militants, from magicians, from sorcerers, you name it. So there were people around who were claiming to be saviors or the new Messiah or whatever, going to restore Israel to its rightful place and throw out the evil invaders, those Romans, and so forth. So that would have certainly been popular talk at the time. Secondly, if you look at the people who wrote things like Paul in particular and the gospel writers, these were educated Jews. So they knew the Old Testament, and there's many references in the New Testament to the Old Testament, which would not be possible unless you were an educated Jew who knew all those stories and all the details from the Old Testament. So we see that, first of all. Secondly, Paul and these guys, they would have known about pagan traditions. So they would have known about Greek philosophy a little bit. They would have known about the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer. They would have known about the mythology stories of the gods and the goddesses and the Roman pantheon and the Greek pantheon and Zeus and Apollo and Hera. They would have known all these things. So you can imagine these guys pulling bits and pieces from popular tradition, pagan tradition, the Old Testament, and kind of bringing these themes together to construct a kind of a new ideology. Because that's really the point, after all, right? So in my book, in the Jesus Hoax book, I'm kind of arguing that Paul and the gospel writers were doing this on purpose. They wanted to get back at the Romans. They wanted to construct a new story because that was really all that they could do. They couldn't fight back militarily because that was the Roman Empire. They would get crushed. So they had to create a new story, a new worldview, almost a new religion, something that would have been pro-Jewish, that would have been supportive of the Jewish people in some way, and yet anti-Roman because they're trying to get the masses away from the Romans. We don't want you to think good of the Romans. We want you to view the Romans as the evil empire, and the Roman pantheon, that's kind of, heathenism and so forth. So you can imagine those would be the obvious elements that Paul and the gospel writers would work into their new worldview, their new ideology. And in fact, that's what you see, right? So you see pro-Jewish elements. So you have this rabbi, Jesus, who was a rabbi. He's the Son of God. He's your personal savior. The God that you're supposed to worship is not Zeus. It's not Apollo. It's not Hera. It's Jehovah. It's the Jewish God. So you worship the Jewish rabbi as your savior, the Jewish God, who's all-powerful, creates the universe. And that's part of the new story. And these other guys, well, these are just heathens. Either these are, followers of the devil and Satan and so forth. And that's a kind of a nifty little trick, right? To get people thinking this way. Let's get them thinking in a pro-Jewish way, in an anti-Roman way, maybe getting them to resist in some subtle way. And that's really kind of a nice means to get the masses on your side. And I really think that was kind of the motivation behind the stories. Because that's really what's been lacking. There's lots of books about criticisms of Jesus' story and Jesus mythicist kind of theses and so forth. But what they really don't talk about is the motive, right? So we can say, okay, it's part of myth, or Paul made these things up, or the gospel writers made these things up. But the question is, but why? Well, why would you do this? You don't just wake up one day and say, well, I think I'll make up a new religion today. No, of course not, right? There has to be a motive. And I think that's the one thing that I really offer in my book, is there was a clear motive, because Paul and the gospel writers want to get back at Rome. They want to undermine support for Rome. They want to get the masses on their side. This was the perfect way to do it. So I really think that's the missing piece of the puzzle that I try to put into my book that really completes the story in a sense.
I've talked to a number of mythicists, and they seem to make like the opposite claim, that the new Gospels are very pro-Roman, and that they were written by Roman figureheads in order to try to make the Jewish people more benign of those kinds. Because it does seem like there are many passages in the New Testament that are far more pro-Roman than typical Jewish doctrine at the time, like give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So what interpretation, how do you interpret that to be more against the Romans?
That's a common response. But in fact, I think that's not true. I've had debates with some of these people and various other podcasts. And I say, well, let's go down the list. Let's list all of the pro-Roman passages that you can find in the letters from Paul or the Gospels. And I'll list all the anti-Roman passages that I can find. And they can come up with about 4 or 5 total of all the New Testament. So you just mentioned them, right? So render unto Caesar, love thy neighbor, pay your taxes. I could give you the citations if you want to. Turn the other cheek. Arguably, those could be considered pro-Roman. I've got probably 36 passages where you're fighting the evil enemy. You're being oppressed by Satan. There's these evil spirits. Put on the armor of God to fight. I could come up with about 36 good passages that are basically anti-authority, anti-Roman passages in Paul's letters and in the New Testament. So to me, it's not even close. People, they just throw that out there without actually looking at the actual evidence. And so, I'm happy to debate that with anybody. Let's just compare. Let's just go down the list and compare the pro-Roman and the anti-Roman. And it's not even close, frankly.
Oh, and I did want to know, like, so I did ask before how much of it was constructed. Um, I think that's an important question. I do want to focus on, was there actually a guy possibly born in Nazareth or Bethlehem who was named Jesus, who did normal kinds of religious things at the time period, or was the entire person as a whole just a culmination of a bunch of different people?
Yeah. No, like I say, I think there was. I suspect because a hoax works best with a real person and a truth at the core. So probably there was a real Jesus. He was a moral guy, agitator for the poor, didn't work any miracles. Maybe he was a great teacher, very inspirational, spoke out against Romans, probably got himself killed, probably got himself crucified, because that's what Romans did with the political instigators. They crucified them. Jesus wasn't the only one. And that, I think that was it. I think that was the kernel of truth in the story. There are other bits and pieces of information that are true in the letters and in the Gospels. I mean, they refer to some actual events. There's physical locations, and they talk about cities and towns that actually existed. So I mean that makes sense. If you're going to construct a fraud, you're going to put in actual places and actual dates as best as you can without being too specific. But you want to give some credibility to your story. That's only obvious. So I think, the kernel of truth was an actual guy, mortal man Jesus, who lived and died. Little bits and pieces of historical fact or geographical facts, and the bulk of it was just a construction after that.
What about the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Are they real people, or are they fictions for the most part?
Well, obviously somebody wrote those, so we don't know if it was one person or multiple people that wrote each of the four gospels. We don't know that. The problem is we know nothing about these four individuals: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All we have is a first name. That's like, you can imagine some Egyptian, digging up some book from 2,000 years ago, and it says it's written by Bob. Oh, okay, wow, all right, Bob, yeah, there you go. Well, that doesn't do me any good. That doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't mean absolutely nothing. It's got to be Bob Smith of Mesopotamia, or something about the guy that you have some reason to know this is an actual person. And that's what all you have. You have gospel according to Mark, gospel according to Luke, gospel according to Matthew. Okay, that tells you really nothing. So we know nothing about these guys. We don't know where they're from, how old they were, what they did afterwards. Was it really one person? Was it really two people, or maybe more people who collaborated and wrote these gospels? It's just a mess, right? And yet we're supposed to take these things as literal truth, every word, literal truth of the word of God, or whatever people say. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the gospel writers definitely weren't the same as the apostles. But do you think the apostles were real people, or were they invented as well?
Well, right. Again, apostles are largely mysterious. If you try to actually look for the list of the 12 apostles, everybody knows there's 12 apostles, and nobody can tell me the names of the 12. I used to do this in my classes when I was teaching. I would talk about Christian ethics. We did a little discussion, and I would say, extra credit for anybody who can name 12 apostles. And I have half my class as Christians, and nobody. Let's just name them, the whole class. Let's write down a list, and they could say, well, Judas, and Paul. No, Paul wasn't one of the apostles. They're trying to think, who's that guy? Philip? Yeah, maybe. Okay, I mean, it's like crazy. And you can't even find the list. There's like different lists of names. There's not like even one list of the 12 apostles. I mean, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But again, I can imagine if Jesus was a real guy, a real rabbi, he probably had some close followers. Okay, that was normal. And maybe there was a group of guys, maybe there was a group of men, maybe some of the names were real people. Yeah, I don't know. But in any case, we know nothing about these people. We don't know what they did. Some of them have overlapping names with a couple of, right, there's a Matthew and I forget even all the options now. A couple of them are overlapping with the gospel writers. Might have been the gospel writers, maybe not. When Jesus dies, what happens to these famous apostles? They kind of drift off and do a few things if you read the book of Acts, and then they just disappear. They're just gone from history. They don't write anything. They maybe try to do a few miracles or something, and then they're gone. They just disappear. So the whole story is just fraught with difficulties and absurdities and things that aren't there, and just mysterious nonsense. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
What about Paul's story? Do you think Paul's story that he described himself as being a convert, persecutor of the Jews, you think that is all true? Or do you think he made that up as well?
Well, that's a good question. So on my thesis, Paul is basically a liar, if I want to put it bluntly. In fact, he's a master liar. So I think he believes nothing of what he wrote. I think he doesn't believe anything of the Jesus story. He knows that he's writing a lie. He's doing it on purpose. He's trying to build up this church for reasons of his own to help him his people. Okay, I understand why he did it. I think probably this vision that he has, right, this road to Damascus story, where he sees this kind of risen Christ. There's this famous story, right, that happens 3 years after the crucifixion. I suspect that was really just kind of a light bulb moment for him. Maybe at some point, maybe about that time, he's kind of like, he's thinking, what can I do? How can I get back at the Romans? I need a kind of a new story. I need a new, image. I need a new worldview that I can kind of use against the Romans and get the people on our side. Then you can imagine, bing, he has this kind of light bulb moment. And he's like, oh yeah, that guy, Jesus. Yeah, he got crucified. People said he was a great God. Yeah, I'll use his story. So I think that was probably, if there was any truth to that, sort of vision, I think that was probably it. It was just a little light bulb moment. He's just saying, yeah, I had this insight, this great story. And he starts, writing down this little, very simple, it's a very simple theology within Paul. If you look at what he says in the letters, he doesn't quote Jesus at all. He says nothing about Jesus's life. There's no virgin birth. There's no manger in Bethlehem. None of that stuff in Paul. It's just Jesus was a guy, son of God, came down, he was risen from the dead, and he's going to save you. And that's it. That's the sum total of it's a really very simple little theological story that we get from Paul. So yeah, okay, I can imagine he just, more or less constructs that based on a kernel of truth. And you can imagine that maybe worked for a while. And then you can imagine the gospel writers coming later and saying, well, wait a minute. Paul didn't say anything. He didn't quote this Jesus guy. We don't know when he was born. We don't know who his mother was. There's no Virgin Mary in Paul. None of that stuff. So you can imagine the gospel writer saying, well, we need to flesh this out. We need to make more of a story of it. So they come up with a virgin birth and the Star of Bethlehem and the miracles and the Sermon on the Mount and all that stuff. That comes later. That's decades later. None of that in Paul. So yeah, Paul had a very little core idea that he developed, and the gospel writers elaborated, and that was the hoax. That was how it emerged, I think.
Gotcha. We got a super chat from Jerry Pina. Really appreciate it. He says, I don't see the anti-Roman passages as explicit as the pro-Roman passages where they mention Roman soldiers and Caesar explicitly. Could you expand a little bit more on your interpretation of the anti and pro-Roman passages and why you think that it's more anti-Roman than pro-Roman?
Yeah. Well, so I think the best explanation is when you're resisting against the Roman powers, and you can't do it explicitly because the Romans don't take that well. They probably imprison you, or they maybe just kill you, or they string you up like Jesus. So you have to throw them a bone. You have to say, "Oh, I'm not against Rome. No, I render to Caesar. I pay my taxes. I'm not breaking the law." That's what you say openly, and then the sort of the subtext below that is, resist the evil powers, and Satan rules the world, and put on the armor of God and all these things. So I can imagine, in the documents, there's a few little bones that like, oh no, we're not opposing, Rome, we're not opposing Caesar, and there's only 2 or 3 passages really literally like that. I mean, we'd have to read through the whole list. I'm looking at a list right here. I've got 14 passages in the letters of Paul. I've got half a dozen in Mark. I've got another dozen in Luke and Matthew that are explicitly, and the resistance, rebellion, opposing the powers, fighting Satan, casting fire upon the earth. I came to bring division, not peace. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. I mean, depends how much time we have. I can go through a whole list of 25 or 30 of them if somebody really wants me to do that. But literally, I mean, there's literally 3 dozen versus 2 or 3 or 4 popular ones that we think about that are pro-Roman. So, yeah.
So I think the argument would be something like those seem to be more like anti some kind of spiritual evil as opposed to specifically geared towards fighting the Romans or the authorities at the time period. Why do you interpret these as specifically aiming towards the Romans?
Well, because they were the ruling power, right? um, that's who was in charge. That was kind of the great Satan would have been Caesar. I mean, here's this pagan heathen who comes in, throws out the Jews, overtakes the temple, destroys the temple in the year 70. This, so these Romans, this is embodiment of evil. These guys are Satan, impersonated, right? Um, uh, you know, um, Manifest in the world. So you can imagine that the resistance would be in terms of fighting this spiritual evil, right? I mean, the the Gospels aren't going to say, pick up a sword and go stab a Roman. I mean, you're not going to find that. That wouldn't even make sense. Even if you wanted to say, you're not going to say, get out there and go kill those Romans. Well, that's not going to work. That's the explicit kind of resistance, which was not working. That had been tried for years before the time of Jesus and Paul. The Romans had been in charge for 60, 70 years at this point. So it had been a long time. Various people were trying the, stab the Roman, option. And, okay, you maybe kill one or two and then you get yourself killed or you get thrown in jail or whatever. So that was the point. Paul was thinking on a much more intellectual plane. We'll call it a spiritual plane. So he's saying we need to fight Satan. We need to fight the ruling powers. We need to rebel against evil. That's what you would do in a theological context, right? It wouldn't be get out there with a sword and slit somebody's throat. You wouldn't say that. You would say fight against Satan, fight against evil. And that's what we see in these passages, in these 3 dozen passages or so that I'm referring to.
So how do you respond to the Christian apologists like Gary Habermas, who says that there's good evidence that, for example, the resurrection happened based on the minimal facts approach that he uses?
The minimal facts approach.
Yeah.
What I guess I don't know that's theory specifically. What is that?
So the minimal facts approach, Gary Habermas is using, he's polling academics, historians about different facts they accept as true about the account of Jesus's resurrection. About, I think the one that I remember the mostly is the empty tomb, that there were people who attested to see Jesus after his death, that there were certain other things that happened before, and that these are accepted facts among historians, and therefore it's reliable to believe that the empty tomb story is true in some case. So there's a lot of apologists who want to build a case for these facts being historically accurate.
Well, it's interesting, and all Christians should think about this, that the key piece of evidence is a lack of something. The key piece of evidence is that there is no evidence, right? This is it. The key piece of the story is I looked in the cave and there's nothing there. My story is true. I mean, that's like absurd. That's absolutely ridiculous on its face. The key piece of element, if my element of the story is there should be no evidence, and I go look for evidence and I find no evidence, and you say, look, I was right. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's an unprovable, that's literally an irrational conclusion to say, my theory says there is no evidence, and when you find no evidence, then my theory is correct. I mean, that's just it's a circular logic. It's undefeatable, because when you say there's no evidence and they don't find any evidence, and you say, well, look, that's what I expected. So just on the front of it, I mean, it's a clever thing. Again, if I'm going to construct a fraud, and I don't want to say, look, there's body X, Y, and Z is buried in location Q, and then somebody's going to go there and look, and they're going to say it's there or not. So I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, look, there's nothing there. There's nothing there to see. And if you don't find any evidence that's exactly the way I'm predicting it, well, okay, that's like fraudster 101, right? I'm going to make something that's completely unverifiable that no one can disprove. I'll make a story about a risen Jesus whose body is gone. He's disappeared. And since you can't find it, well, then I guess I'm right. I mean, that's got zero credibility. That makes no sense. It's a nifty little trick, but it's obviously it's stupid beyond belief that people would accept that fact as some kind of evidence that the story is correct.
So what about the extra biblical accounts? Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, Tertullian. What about all the historians that mentioned Christianity and Jesus around the time period?
Well, that's part of the evidence story, right? So I said during Jesus' lifetime, there is no evidence, which is absolutely true. Nothing during Jesus' lifetime, 0 to 30. Nothing for the next 20 years, from the year 30 to 50. Nothing at all. For the next 20 years, from 50 to 70, we only have 7 letters from Paul. 7 letters from one guy who he's the hoaxer. So okay, that doesn't count as any evidence. Then you have the next 40 years where all you have is the Gospels, and these guys were part of the hoax too. You still have nothing. You got to go all the way to Josephus, if you know the story, right? So Josephus was a Jewish writer working um, for Rome, working for the emperor, and in the year 93, what is it, Antiquities of the Jews, and he makes one or two passing mentions. People aren't even sure if it's actually correct. They think maybe it was altered later. He makes one or two passing references. There was this guy, Jesus, and he has followers, and they said he was the Son of God. Okay, so that's like the year 93. So that's, again, decades after the crucifixion. He's one guy. He's the first guy who's not a Christian that documents it. Then you have to go all the way out to the year 115, and then you have Pliny the Elder. You have Tacitus, who's writing, and this is about the year 115. And they have just a couple little passages. Yeah, there's these guys, Christians. Yeah, they're troublemakers and they're rabble rousers, and we don't like them. I mean, and that's it. I mean, this is like 100 years after the time of Jesus that you get the non-Christian corroborating evidence that there even were Christians, right? That's all you get. You get one little blip in the year 93. You get a couple little passages, a couple paragraphs in the year 115. Then, in the year 130, 150, then you got to start to get the early Christian fathers start writing a little bit of stuff. But it's decades and decades and decades down the road. And obviously at some point there were Christians. So obviously at some point they're going to write about it. But it's so far removed from the events that that's yet another reason to think that something was wrong here, something was constructed, the situation isn't what we're being told, and then it wasn't until 100 years later, till this movement starts gaining some traction, that it really starts to get any kind of real notice.
Isn't that more evidence than we typically have of most people from history and antiquity? Like, it seems like the vast majority of people from back then we have no evidence for, no writings of whatsoever. But we typically grant most of them existed. So why would this case we go the extra step and say, even though we have some basis of evidence for this character, we still should reject his being a real character in some sense?
Right. Well, right. So I've heard the argument before. People say, well, look, we don't have any evidence for Plato at the time that Plato lived. We don't have any evidence for Socrates at the time that Socrates lived. So why don't you think there's a Socrates hoax or a Plato hoax, right? Okay, well, but that's a completely different situation, right? I mean, we have lots of pointers, evidence from other people who also lived at that time. That the actual documents aren't for centuries later, which is true. But that there was nothing essential about creating a fake character. I suppose in theory it's possible there was just a fake Socrates that somebody invented at some time, and maybe there never really was a guy. And I guess, I mean, in a sense I could say, well, maybe in a way I don't really care, right? I mean, there's these great stories about Socrates, and there's this philosophical wisdom in Plato, and I would say, well, look, the wisdom, it holds up. I mean, it's interesting ideas, it's valid philosophical arguments, it's kind of intriguing, analyses of human nature. I said, this is actually really interesting, valuable stuff. It doesn't matter whether there was an actual Plato or there were three guys and they all worked together and called themselves Plato, or no Plato at all. I mean, I still have the stuff still holds up. In a sense, it doesn't really matter. I can extract the ideas from the person. But it's completely different with Jesus. First of all, we're talking Son of God. We're not just talking some philosophical guy or some writer. We're talking the Son of God who came down raising people from the dead, walking on water, curing people from, leprosy and so forth. So that's a hugely different situation. And furthermore, his whole claim for authenticity is that he really did exist. He really was the Son of God. He really did those miracles. His whole story hinges on that being true. And so both the bar is higher and wider than anybody else in history. It's impossible to think the Son of God is walking here on the earth and nobody wrote about it. Nobody said anything about it for decades afterwards. I mean, that's like impossible, right? That there's no contemporaneous evidence, so the standard is so much higher for a Jesus type figure if he's the Savior, Son of God. it's not a plausible argument to say, well, look, well, nobody has any contemporaneous evidence, right? It's intrinsic to his whole story. It's it's essential to that story, and we simply don't have it. So it's far more damning in the case of Jesus than anybody else that you might want to point to in history.
So one of the arguments apologists use is that there has to be some basis of truth here because of how popular Christianity became. Why did it explode and become so popular and take over the world? Doesn't that imply that there's some truth behind it?
Well, no, it doesn't actually. There, well, a couple of things. I mean, it's an interesting story. It's a story of morality. I mean, there's some morality behind it, right? I mean, it's built on some of the moral precepts of the Old Testament and so forth. So there's a kind of moral code there. People like moral codes. People like stories of salvation and saviors. People like to think they're not going to die and that Jesus is going to save them after they die. So there's a lot of intrinsic reasons to believe the story. People are afraid of hell. They like to, okay, I need to be good because I don't want to go to hell. So, okay, that's another little intrinsic reason. We'll sort of entice you and we'll scare you into believing our story. So there were sort of psychological factors at work, which are understandable. But even beyond that, there's lots of things that masses of people believed for hundreds or thousands of years that weren't true. So, for example, the good examples I like to bring up in class, we used to think that the stars were on a big sphere, a celestial sphere, right, that spun around the earth. And when you look at that side of the night, and you can see the stars turning around you. Well, it's obvious. The stars are on a big sphere, and they're rotating around the earth. Right? It's called the celestial sphere. And some very smart people for literally thousands of years said, yeah, those stars are on a big sphere and they're turning. And the only question is, well, how big is the sphere? And how many stars are on that sphere, right? And what's behind that sphere? That was the only question. And so people believed it. That was total nonsense, right? People believed in witches for centuries. People believed that there was witches who had supernatural powers and they were allied with the devil and we're going to burn them on the stake. They did that to thousands of people. They were completely wrong, right? People believed for literally 2,000 years that there were only 4 elements in the world: fire, air, earth, and water. This ancient theory of 4 elements, it goes back to Empedocles, about 500 BC. For literally 2,000 years, people said, yes, everything in the universe is made of fire, air, earth, and water. Completely wrong. So I mean, there's lots of examples that we can give where lots of people, very smart people, for long periods of time believed things that were completely wrong. And this is just another example of that.
What about the argument that there are more biblical texts and evidence of Jesus than any other history, including Alexander the Great? So more evidence of Jesus than Alexander the Great because of all the number of manuscripts and writings we have of Jesus' existence.
Yeah. Well, there's actually not. Like I said, there's really, essentially, there's no evidence. It's not just there's zero, literally zero evidence of Jesus living as a Savior, Son of God who performed miracles. There's literally nothing. Just stories. Just somebody writing down says it happened. That doesn't count. That's not evidence. All the writings that we talk about comes from, at first, the early church fathers who started coming, the year 150, 170 AD, around the year 200. So these guys, okay, they're believing the Christian story. Now they're 2 centuries removed from the fact, and they start writing, and hearing stories and relating fables and interjecting new things and so forth. So yeah, obviously, as the religion starts to build force, then there's lots of writings. That stuff doesn't occur till 200, 300 years later. During the first 100 years of the Christian era, there's like nothing. You got the few letters from Paul, you got the 4 Gospels, you got Josephus, who wrote 1 paragraph. That's it, literally. So don't tell me there's lots of evidence. You got nothing to support this theory at all, except for 100 or 200 years later. I'm sorry, that doesn't work.
And earlier you mentioned Nietzsche and his writings. What did Nietzsche say about Jesus and Christianity in general? You said it was like something that was bad for Western society.
Yeah, right. So Nietzsche had this theory about master morality, slave morality, right? So his view was the Greeks and the Romans had a very powerful, life-affirming, dynamic kind of worldview. That was part of their part of their whole outlook on the world. They didn't look at the afterlife. They had gods and goddesses, but they didn't worry about those guys. Okay, Zeus throws lightning bolts, and Poseidon makes earthquakes, but other than that, you just kind of live your life, and you have one life. This is your life right here, and you need to be a best person, have it be an excellent character, and live the best possible life. And that was sort of the ethos of Greece and Rome. And then along comes the Christian worldview, and the Christian worldview says, no, this world is not your real life. Your real life is your afterlife. This is just a place of suffering and sin, pain and death and nasty stuff. So this world kind of sucks, and you need to work for the afterlife. That's what really matters. So what the Christian outlook did, maybe even indirectly, maybe unconsciously in a sense, it's a little bit hard to say, but they took the whole focus off of this world, which became evil, bad, suffering, and sin, and they put all the goodness in the next world, in the next life, the afterlife. And Nietzsche says that was horribly damaging, kind of to the whole psyche, the whole momentum, the whole energy behind Western civilization, because this view took hold once Rome collapsed in the year 376. And then sort of eventually the Christian worldview, Christian religion rises to take its place. And so you have almost 2,000 years at the time of Nietzsche. He says, we've been ruled by this pathetic, kind of lowly, pity-based, kind of morality. It's basically a slave morality that these Jews created under the conditions of being enslaved by Rome. And it's sort of lowly, pity-mongering, suffering, blessed, pick up your cross and follow me, and blessed are the sufferers, and then the meek are blessed, the meek will inherit the earth. I mean, all this kind of stuff that you would have never heard from the Greeks. You would have never heard that from the Romans, because they had a strong, kind of noble, powerful outlook on life. And so Nietzsche said, look, we kind of allowed this master morality to collapse. And then this sort of pathetic, lowly kind of slave morality kind of rose up in its place, and it's just drained society of its value. It's kind of caused this kind of fixation on suffering and sin and painfulness. And he said it's just been like a lead weight for 2,000 years on Western civilization. And I think in a sense he's right. I mean, you used a constructed, fake, bogus morality as the basis of your civilization. It's going to do nothing but drag you down for 2,000 years. And I think that was Nietzsche's conclusion. I think he was right.
Well, the typical argument would be like Christianity and religion created a social foundation to build communities together, and that's why it's so popular. It has like an evolutionary advantage of some kind. Do you think that that's partially true, that that religion provided a benefit to societies, and the fact that it focused more helping on like the poor and helping people in need, which then benefited society in some way? Or do you think that's more of a stretch?
Well, like I say, of course, there are some moral precepts in Christianity, which are older ideas. They're pre-Christian or they're pagan ideas, right? To help the poor and to, respect your family and, maybe, have a kind of a spiritual sort of outlook in some vague sense. I mean, that was kind of all sort of well-established ideas back at the time, 2,000 years ago. You could say, well, look, there are some benefits, social benefits to, being kind and forgiving and respecting others, and do not kill, and the 10 Commandments and all these kind of nice things. But I don't need a Jesus figure to tell me it's bad to kill somebody, right? I don't need Jesus to tell me I should respect my parents. I already know that. That's just an inherently good thing to do. I need to honor my family, and have a good life and be a good person. I don't need Jesus to tell me that. It's already a good idea to do that on several independent bases. So whatever little benefits come from Christianity, I think it's because of those sort of universal moral precepts that anybody could have and would have defended, and they did for hundreds of years before there was a Jesus. And then you just wrap these little, valid ideas, and you wrap it in a Christian package, and you throw it out there and say, oh, look how wonderful this is. And well, no, you just took some ideas that were universally recognized as beneficial. Don't kill, love your neighbor, right? Respect your family. And if there was a benefit, those are just generically beneficial ideas. It's got nothing to do with the Christian part. And the Christian part, if anything, damaged those outlooks. It took the emphasis away from this world. It put it all in the next world. It said, don't worry about this life. Just focus on the next life, which is a completely unverifiable proposition. I can promise you anything after you die, and you can never prove me wrong. You can never come back for a refund. You can never say I was swindled because, well, look, you're already dead. You're gone, right? So, I mean, that's like a perfect scam. That's the perfect scam. I can sell you anything you want, and I promise you, you'll get everything in the world after you die. And if you don't like it, come back and get a full refund. Oh, okay, no problem. That's a no-brainer. That's an easy sell, and you can see how silly that is, right? That's basically what they did. They took basic moral precepts, which were valid, and they wrapped it up in a silly, ridiculous story, and they sold it to you like a snake oil salesman would sell it to you.
Gotcha. We have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course, sure.
Winston's mom asks, could you talk a bit about Paul's take on the female and her place in Christianity?
Yeah, so women were fairly disparaged. If you look in the letters of Paul and even in the Gospels, there's a couple of good passages. I don't know the source offhand. It's about, women need to remain silent. They shall not speak. They are just sort of, lowly second-class citizens. I mean, that makes sense, right? That would have been the normal ethos of the time, both in the Jewish community at the time. Certainly, women were not rabbis. It was a very patriarchal society among the Jews at the time. And even among the Romans and the Greeks, I mean, pretty much everybody at the time would have been a patriarchal society. Women had sort of no rights. They weren't really sort of equal citizens. They were just sort of there, just taking care of the kids. So you would have expected, in fact, this is another argument in my favor, by the way, you would expect if there was really a wise kind of all-seeing God who somehow, the spirit behind Jesus or the gospel writers, he would have said things like, oh, by the way, like we would today, oh, women are equal to the men and they should have equal rights and they should be treated in the same level as all the men. But no, you don't see that. You don't see any sort of divine wisdom that should treat women as good as men. No. Women are basically clearly second-class citizens all throughout the New Testament. And you're like, well, what kind of God is this? What is he? Is he a patriarchal God? He never really liked the women. I mean, that's ridiculous. You would expect a God who would try to, move morality forward, like we would say today. Well, look, ethics have moved forward. We treat women equally now. No, you don't see that back there. Nothing in Paul, nothing in the gospel writers. Nope, it's just the same old story that you would expect from a group of Jewish writers who are writing these things down. That's what we get.
Sky High J asks, how much psychedelics were involved in this? I think he's referring to like the burning bush. Do you think that a lot of visions were involved in making up these stories? Did Paul use those to come up with these stories?
Yeah, there's some funny theories about, relating Jesus to these, magic mushroom things and psychedelics and stuff. I mean, because some do sound pretty psychedelic. I mean, there's little incidences in Paul which kind of sound like he was on some kind of trip or something. And certainly you read like Revelations. I mean, all of Revelation sounds like it's kind of a bad LSD trip or something. So I don't know. I suspect, my feeling, I don't have a lot of evidence either way. Probably it's a very minor aspect. You can imagine the state of medicine 2,000 years ago. People don't understand how the mind works. They don't know anything about neurophysiology. Okay, I eat this certain plant or smoke this thing, and suddenly, wow, I'm seeing all these crazy things. Okay, you can imagine that gets connected to divine inspiration, right? I mean, that's a typical thing among all primitive societies. They had intoxicants of various kinds, and they would attribute this to spiritual powers and magical powers. And okay, it never allowed anybody to walk on water, never allowed anybody to bring you back from the dead. But you got these crazy, internal kind of, gyrations going on from psychedelics or whatever intoxicants you might have. So probably maybe in the background, there's a little bit of inspiration for it, but I suspect really that was quite minor in the whole story.
Gotcha. Matthew Simpson asks, how would David respond to the, I don't care about scriptural criticism or historical proof. I saw Jesus 5 years ago, and that's how I know it's all true.
Yeah, well, I used to because I taught for almost 20 years at University of Michigan, and I would teach courses on Christian ethics, and we would talk about sort of these arguments, and I would ask my class every time, I would say, you know, well, usually in context of God, I would say, what reason do you have to believe that God exists? In the Bible, God came down and talked to people. He was talking, God is talking, and Job is answering in the burning bush and all these kind of things. And I said, well, that doesn't happen anymore. Nobody really talks to God. Nobody talks to Jesus anymore. I said, I don't think so. I haven't heard of any stories like this in like 2,000 years, but maybe. And I asked the class, well, some of you are Christians, and people say, yeah, we're Christians. And I say, well, how do you know that God or Jesus exist, right? And do you talk to them? Do you ever talk to God? I'm asking my class. Do you talk to God? Do you talk to Jesus? Almost nobody says, once in a while a person says, yeah, I talk to God. Okay. Oh, that's cool. I said, well, good. Next time you talk to God, I've got some questions for you. I'm going to write down a whole list of unsolvable mathematical problems that I want you to ask God when you're talking to God and get the answer, because he'll know, because he's God. And you come back and tell me, when you give me the answer to that one, I'll be really impressed, and I'm going to sign up for your church, and I'll be right there. I'll be going to church every Sunday. You know how often that's happened in 20 years? Yeah, zero. Never happens. No, we never we never really talk to God. We never really talk to Jesus. If you had a vision, maybe you were on one of those bad trips that we were just talking about a minute ago. So yeah, the fact that some people say, I saw God, I saw Jesus, I talk to Jesus all the time. Oh, really? Okay, good. Let's have some discussions then. Oh no, we don't do that. No, he doesn't actually answer questions. No, I'm sorry, we can't get any information from him. Well, okay, you're just giving me a line then. So you can believe your little fairy story. I believe in unicorns too. I talk to unicorns all the time. Don't ask me to solve any problems, but okay, I like a unicorn story and you like a Jesus story, and we'll just leave it at that, right?
How would you respond to Ramanujan, the famous mathematician who said he was speaking to the Hindu gods and they gave him answers to these big math problems?
Well, there you go. Maybe there's a Ramanujan, I don't know, or maybe Krishna is out there as answering mathematical questions, but yeah, okay. Obviously, these things come from out of the blue and you don't know where they come from. It's like, well, it came from God. Well, okay, maybe, but yeah, you can't put much credence in those stories, obviously.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about an hour. I really appreciate your time and coming on and having a conversation with me. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, again, it's all the basic stories, concise stories in the Jesus Hoax book. It's available online. Should be available on Amazon, although they tend to like ban books lately. So I don't know if they did decide they're going to ban this one, but hopefully not. I think it's still on Amazon. There's a hard copy. It's not a difficult book. It's a very concise book. I had a JesusHoax.com website. People can get a little bit more details. There's an e-book Kindle version, I think, of Jesus Hoax, if you want to pull it up on a tablet or something. So people can do that as well. And there's more information on my work at davidskrbina.com. So I have a little personal website if anybody's curious about some of my other writings. Yeah, I just encourage people to kind of do the research, be open-minded, be critical thinking, and and see what comes from this. It's really kind of an intriguing story, for sure.
Awesome. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.